God is dead, and all of those arguments that you see out there in the world today. These are all an extension of that. Where you see it in universities, and this goes back to what we started out by talking about, is that when Darwin was in university, there were only two faculties. There was the Faculty of Natural Sciences, and then there were the Faculty of the Humanities. Now, the humanities involved religion, language, literature, history, and so on. And then, of course, the natural sciences were biology, physics. And what's interesting, by the way, about this, and a lot of people don't know this today, is that mathematics was in the humanities side of things. Because at many universities today, if you take only a math major with no other science courses, you get an arts degree, you don't get a science degree. Because math is pure logic. And where do they teach pure logic? But in philosophy courses. And philosophy courses are in the humanities, not in the natural sciences. So this gives you an idea of a lot of the confusion that's going on and why it's evolved. Now, once you, and by the way, at the time that Darwin published, 1859, he was reluctant to publish. He didn't want to publish. His friends were pushing him, and they were pushing him particularly because a guy by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace had already written to Darwin with a 42-page essay outlining what became Darwin's evolutionary theory. Wallace had already worked this out for himself, and Darwin's friends were saying, hey, this guy's going to get credit. You're going to get upstaged. You've got to get published out there. One of the questions that Wallace posed, and he basically introduced the concept, he didn't use the term, but he introduced the concept of intelligent design, which is also part of the debate that's going on. And Wallace said, look, in your theory, you have to explain why humans are so totally different than any other animal, that if you start to think about, even mathematics or the technologies or you take anything that we do, there's not an animal that's even close to that, a language or anything else. Now, you notice in Darwin's Origin of the Species, he never mentions humans at all. He ignores the problem completely. And of course, Wallace gets after him about that. So eventually Darwin published The Ascent of Man as an answer to Wallace's charges. But you read The Ascent of Man, what Darwin does in that is he tries to argue that there are other animals doing all of the same things that humans are doing. Well, I'm sorry, and that's, by the way, where that joke came up about, if you gave chimpanzees, a bunch of chimpanzees typewriters, they'd eventually type out the works of Shakespeare. That's where that ludicrous joke came from. Now, what happened in the universities and amongst academia and the young people was, once you've removed God as the explanation for humans being here and being different from the other animals, then you're left with a vacuum. How do you explain that difference? And as I said, Wallace intimated intelligent design, and a lot of people are arguing for that. That's not really satisfactory. So what happened was, for the young people into that vacuum of, because we are, above all else, the moral ape, there into that vacuum came the need for a belief system, and that became environmentalism. So it effectively became a religion to replace Christianity, particularly, because if you look at the other religions, they don't have any problem with this. One of the interesting things about the whole Muslim debate is go and look at what the Muslims think about humanity and how different we are from the other animals and all the rest of it. They're not even discussing the issue. Mm-hmm. And so this starts to put into perspective the idea of how environmentalism became a cult. And of course, now what you've got going on in the universities is a complete overthrow of the traditions of science and the traditions of academia. Because what happened was that in the old days, the old professors and the older guard taught the prevailing wisdom. They say, look, this is what we know, and this is what we believe, and this is what we understand. Then the new young people came in and challenged that. What's happening now is that the new young people are coming into universities totally indoctrinated into the environmental religion, and they're going into the schools of journalism and elsewhere. The people that are challenging now that ideology are the old guys like me and like Fred Singer, who's in his 90s, and they're saying no, 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 no. You're now totally indoctrinated. You're not practicing science. You're not practicing the progress of ideas and debate. And so that's how they've managed to turn this whole thing upside down. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded story, but it kind of gives a context for why you are able to say that this has all of these symptoms of a cult.
You bet. That's really good background. I want to turn our attention towards the Paris Climate Summit. This at the end of this month. I believe it starts on November 30 and goes through December 11. A lot of press has been given to this. There's a number of articles appearing every day now in the media somewhere in the world stating, something like the balance of humanity hangs, and whatever. Yep. It's all important, and if we don't solve it this time, we're all going to be doomed, and so on and so on. And this comes on the heels of the 2030 Agenda Conference that was held on September 20 in New York City. That's the one that the Pope came to speak. Yep. And they created...
And by the way, appearing before Congress and mixing religion and politics. And it's where were the ACLU complaining about that?
Oh, no, I know. There was nobody. Yeah, the Pope gets a free pass, for sure.
Of course.
Yes. But the 2030 Agenda document that was approved by some 180 nations, and then there was also along with that, of course, there was the new Sustainable Development Goals, which replaced the Millennium Development Goals, the so-called MDGs, that were created in the year 2000, but those expire at the end of this year. So that partly was the purpose of the 2030 Agenda Conference at the United Nations in September. And so this climate change summit comes right between the September meeting for the 2030 Agenda and the actual start date, which would be January 1 of 2016, of these new SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I have observed now historically that sustainable development, as it's proposed by the United Nations, it seems to be the goal of their efforts. But climate change is seemingly being used as the velvet hammer, if you will, to get people to panic and stampede into sustainable development. So here we have this climate change summit coming up at the end of this month. The head of climate change at the United Nations, Christiana Figueres, says this is going to be the biggest conference probably within 15 years in either direction. And she actually opined on a video recently that if they don't get their agenda done this November, December, that it will take them another 10 to 15 years to build momentum to where it is today. So even on the inside of this, they see that there's some risk going on. Some countries are starting to scratch their heads and wonder, are we going to get hosed again on this, and who's going to pay for all this stuff, et cetera, et cetera. But what in your view on this, what is the deal coming up at this Paris Climate Change Summit?
Well, the Paris Climate Change Conference, and by the way, that sequence of the meeting before the meeting and then the summit and then the funding, that's always been the pattern. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. The Paris Conference is actually officially COP21. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. And when Maurice Strong, who's now, by the way, hiding out in China because the U.S. government wants him for fraud, he set up the United Nations Environment Program in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. George Herbert Walker Bush refused to go. He said, no, it's just a political agenda, and using environment for a political agenda, he would not participate in it. He was absolutely right. And subsequently, of course, the U.S. Senate voted against one of the outcomes of that whole thing, and that was the Kyoto Protocol. They voted 95-0 against it. But the Conference of the Parties were set up as the political vehicle to advance the climate change agenda. Now, what Maurice Strong did was he took the views of the Club of Rome, which were expounded starting in the early 1960s, 61, 62. And the Club of Rome took the Malthusian view, and this is Thomas Malthus, the person in the 19th century who said the world's overpopulated, and he made the simple cause-effect correlation and said that the population is outgrowing the food supply. He was absolutely wrong, totally wrong, but that idea that the population is putting a demand on resources was taken up by the Club of Rome in the 60s. Maurice Strong was a very, very important member of that, as were Gorbachev and a few other very, very influential and powerful people, the Rockefellers and so on. So the Club of Rome took that idea of the population would outgrow the food supply and applied it to everything. They said the population will outgrow all resources, and that's where they introduced the term in a very simplistic computer model they produced called limits to growth. In other words, what they were saying is we've got to reduce the population, we've got to reduce the developed nations' populations because they're the ones that are using the resources at a greater rate than any other nation. And so that was the underlying idea. One of the people that was influential in this was Paul Ehrlich at Stanford University. There are other people. And in fact, Ehrlich published a book with John Holdren, who is now Obama's science czar, who's really pushing the whole climate change agenda. He's the one that came up with the term polar vortex, which is a completely unscientific term. He's the one that came up with the term climate disruption. He's the one that, through John Kerry, influenced the Pope to become part of this. But he was publishing with Paul Ehrlich. They published a book called Environment, Resources, and Population in the 1970s. They made predictions about, and Ehrlich, by the way, published the population bomb that was underlying all of this. Their predictions in all of that were completely wrong, but nonetheless, it gained momentum. And you still hear people saying, well, okay, I agree with you that the climate's not a problem, but overpopulation is a problem. It's another of the myths. It's simply false, but this was part of it. Now, here's the thing. Maurice Strong, in a book called The Cloak of Green, written by a proper investigative journalist by the name of Elaine Dewar, D-E-W-A-R, she interviewed him for 5 days in these offices at the United Nations after the Rio conference and said, well, look, what's going on here? And he said, look, the problem for the world is the developed nations, that they're using up the resources at too great a rate, and it's our responsibility to get rid of the industrialized nations. They are the problem.